Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Rodriguez, and I'm the Industry Engagement and Outreach Officer for the Data Science Institute here at Columbia University. Today's seminar is an iCubed, which stands for Institute, Industry, and Innovation. These seminars connect our industry affiliates to the larger Columbia community to explore topics at the forefront of industry. We invite data scientists, engineers, and researchers from our affiliate program to give a talk about a recent project, case study, or the data science work that they're engaged in. During these educational events, we encourage attendees to ask questions via the chat or Q&A feature, and also here in person. Today's talk is titled Responsible AI and AI Risk Management for Financial Services. And today's speaker is A.B. Chatterjee, Principal Director at Accenture. He's a seasoned financial services executive, helping large organizations undertake effective analytics-led transformation, leveraging the best of business and technology enablers. This talk will provide an overview of responsible AI and risk management in financial services, with a deep dive on key focus areas for banks, regulatory expectations, developing and governing models, and case study covering transformational programs on AI enablement run at a top 3 bank. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker up to the stage, well, podium.
Thank you, and really appreciate for the warm introduction. Just a quick check. I hope everyone is able to hear me and look at the slides. Let me know if there is. Okay, we're good. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone on the call and people present on in person. My name is A.B. Chatterjee, and I am a principal director with Accenture Strategy Consulting. And I think we will get into a little bit more about what I do in a bit. Today's session, as was introduced, is about AI risk management and delivering AI responsibly, specifically in financial services. And what we will do. Okay. So I think over the next 45 minutes or so, what we'll try to cover is we'll do a quick introduction. Then we'll kind of talk about a bit in terms of what is the landscape with respect to AI scaling and applicability in financial services. A quick roundup on what folks at FS are doing, and then get into some basics around developing and managing models responsibly. And I will take an example of a program run in a large bank, which was around managing AI risks and delivering AI responsibly. So what we will not do today is essentially go into the details and the techniques of various things that we do around explainability, bias, fairness, etc. But what we'll try and achieve over the next 45 minutes is to kind of give you a landscape around what is happening in financial services. What are some of the key challenges that C-suite is facing? How are they trying to overcome those? What is the regulatory expectation from banks and insurers? And also, to some extent, what kind of programs are we seeing that is being run across the top banks? What are the top priorities with respect to managing risks that are associated with AI and ML applications, both internally developed as well as external solutions that they employ to drive multiple decisions across the enterprise and organization? So that's at a very high level, the agenda. And quickly to kind of provide some context on where I come from. So spent 15 plus years working with Accenture Strategy Consulting, mostly do analytics and data science led transformation for financial services firms. Have extensive experience doing risk analytics, mostly around credit, market, and operational risk. We'll touch upon some of the concepts there as when we speak today. I also kind of am involved heavily with fraud and financial crime mitigation and control using advanced AI ML applications. And I also kind of take a look at quantifying emerging risks associated with AI. I do a bit of climate risk analytics. So those are things which are emerging risks that are coming in for financial services firms. on top of credit market and operational risk constraints that we typically see. Now, to start off the conversation, I think so. What we'll do is we'll kind of take some of, if you have any of your questions, we'll be able to take it up in the last 15 minutes or so, and we'll kind of pause in between. I don't know. Can we pause in between and take questions from people?
Yes.
Yeah. So we can also try that. If people have any specific questions, then maybe we can pause between different sections and take questions. Okay?
So we do have quite a few folks on the Zoom, so I'm just going to tell them to ask questions.
Yes. Yeah. And if you can see those questions, I probably cannot see it here. Just let me know and we can take those questions. Thank you. Okay, so start off the conversation. I think one of the first things that I wanted to give you a flavor of is, what are the typical challenges that the financial services, or how does the financial services landscape look like with respect to adoption of AI and scaling of AI? Right? The word scaling becomes extremely important because, like, while I was growing up, I think my idea of doing something cool was something unique, something which is a differentiator, and that should set me up for success, right? What I've realized over the last 15, 16 years of my career is that any particular thing that we try to do has to be scalable and has to be kind of in a position wherein a lot of people can adopt to those solutions and can pretty much utilize them on a day-to-day basis, right? So if I talk to the C-suite, and this is the result that came out from one of our surveys that we did, with the C-suite across multiple large financial services firms across the globe. What we realized is that most C-suite personnel are concerned with their ability to scale AI solutions in their organization, meaning that they still find that there's a lot of challenge that is there to be overcome, especially when they're looking at implementing many of the AI solutions that are promising, but at the same time have limited, I would say, implementation or limited scaling abilities at this point in time, right? And one of the key challenges that they have identified is that they definitely need to scale those solutions, and they have a high risk of going out of business in 5 years if they don't scale AI appropriately. So in order to kind of maintain their competitive advantage, scaling of AI is extremely important. The other big challenge that they think about is they are concerned about, whether they have the right team to build a futuristic, future-leaning, AI transformation enabled organization. And, they still are struggling with, maintaining and monitoring their models, maintaining their solutions in order to kind of ensure that the solutions are actually performing the kind of objectives that they were designed for, right? In the last bit, what also became very evident was that they're aware that there are ethical considerations that must be dealt with. And I think the inclusion of all of these considerations, which will help drive responsible AI, becomes one of the cornerstone or key capabilities for them to succeed in the future. Now, traditionally, we have always seen that there is a trade-off between innovation and risk. So while people want to do cool things, there are risks associated with it. And I think one of the primary industries which kind of deals with this conundrum is the financial services industry, which is heavily regulated and wants to be people-centric, wherein any decision that is taken by a large bank or a large insurer has a direct impact on customers, and they really want to ensure that all those decisions are well taken care of and all those decisions are thought through. They have the right frameworks of risk management associated with those decisions. So managing the trade-off between or kind of getting to the right ROI or return on investment on these solutions becomes extremely critical. And we'll see some of the examples of good solutions gone wrong and the implication of that large firms have had to kind of face. So net, I think, what we have learned from the industry is that the value delivered out of scaling AI solutions responsibly is definitely something that can drive easily 20 to 40% savings on AI OpEx, which is good enough to kind of put the right financials in perspective for any enterprise or organization. Now, I briefly touched upon, what happens when there is an absence of adequate risk management, right? And these are things which are, which are coming in from media reports. Multiple examples of, AI algorithms going wrong, and the impact is directly on multiple things that large firms or organizations have to bear with, right? So there is a direct impact on brand reputation. There are missed commercial opportunities if a particular solution does not go as per plan, right? Possible fines, uh, process improvement opportunities are missed, and a lot of inefficiencies that kind of creep up given the lack of risk management, I would say, frameworks and principles, right? So the important part here is that we have seen many of these examples. I'll not go into into the details of each of those examples that we talked about. I mean, glaring cases wherein not enough, I would say, not enough focus on getting the right things have resulted in reputational risk for very known and prominent firms, right? So moving on from there, in order to ensure that those things don't happen, right? There is a regulatory focus on making sure that across the globe there are principles and fundamentals which financial services institutions must follow in order to safeguard their shareholders from any loss in value associated with any particular AI or ML solution that they are working with, right? So some examples in the US, I mean, there are several, including the OCC. OCC is the Officer of Controller and Controls. They are primarily a regulatory body who are kind of governing rules and regulations for financial services firms. And there is a detailed handbook that they came up with in 2021, which talks about how to effectively manage risks associated with any AI ML solutions, including internally developed models, any particular model definition, enterprise-wide AI policy, how some of these models need to be tiered and monitored. And we'll talk about each of those concepts very briefly here. And then kind of go into making sure that there are several other organizations also coming up with other regulatory organizations coming up with rules to ensure that the common man or anyone walking on the street is well protected against the I would say unintended consequences of AI ML solutions, right? So that's pretty much the backdrop of regulators waking up to the idea of making sure that any of the decisions that are taken are in financial services which have some kind of an impact on an individual is well protected. Now, if those things were in place, then we can go back to this slide and see that maybe 2018, when there were some reports on social media giant on the way they marketed their mortgage programs, which was like biased towards certain protected classes. Those would have been stopped. There was this published incident of a large financial services firm tying up with a large payments provider, for their own card business, and that kind of did not go right, and there were reports of discrimination by gender. So those are things that could have been avoided well in advance, and regulators are waking up to it. And recently, in the last 2 to 3 years, we are seeing many regulations coming up, which are essentially trying to kind of hold back on any such unintended consequences to the consumer. So this is the quick landscape of where we are with respect to in financial services world. Again, I would say that a lot of promise with respect to things that can be kind of taken up, and we'll quickly talk about what are financial services firms doing currently, and then we will kind of quickly take in some key principles next in terms of how to develop and manage models responsibly. I can take a question and pause maybe. Is there any question that we have?
We do have a question.
Yeah, I can take it now based on.
Okay. Are these AI regulatory authorities focused on financial services, or are they a general algorithmic governing body? And then second point, are there review guidelines available in the public domain that companies can look at to get out their algorithm?
Yeah, great question. So I think it is there are these regulatory bodies in different geographies, and they are not specific to any industry per se. But given there are certain industries which are more, or I would say which are more regulated, given the kind of impact that they have. Financial services is one of them, because any decision that is taken up by large financial services firms have direct implication on customers. Life sciences could be another example wherein any automated decisioning happening could pretty much impact lives, and therefore some industries I would say are more regulated than the others. And for each of those industries, you will see that across the globe there are specific governing bodies which kind of have these regulations in place. Now, for example, in the US, we have Fed, we have OCC, we have MDIC, we have NIST, and other organizations who have come up with these regulations. And to answer your second question, yes, these are publicly available documents. So the idea is to kind of educate everyone about the best practices that are required and that should be associated with utilizing any AI ML models or algorithm which one is considering to kind of deploy enterprise-wide. And the approach that these regulators have taken is to kind of make sure that they are kind of educating everyone about the requirements, about some of the pillars which are governing these actions, and it's important that everyone has transparency and has full view of what these regulations are and what they mean to individuals. Yep. I'll move on, go to the next section, and we can kind of continue to collect questions, and I can take it up once we wrap this up. I think it would be good to kind of quickly take a view of what are financial services institutions kind of doing, and what are the challenges that they have at this point in time. So clearly, when we talk about the key things or the key themes of AI risk management, there are, I would say, 6 different pillars with which we approach this problem, right? So everybody understands that. So today we are in a space wherein we cannot afford to not use AI and ML related innovations that we have, right? And at the same time, we know that there are some downstream effects which have to be controlled. So how does one approach this problem, right? And what are the best ways in which large organizations will tend to identify and approach solving for this across enterprise? And in that context, we basically look at 6 broad themes to talk about. We talk about the process governance part, which is essentially about making sure that all the processes that are associated with any AI ML based transformation are adequately taken, are adequately considered, and we have the right guardrails associated with it. Model risks, I will briefly touch upon the definition of model as is provided by OCC, and basically, any algorithm is what we can potentially classify as a model, and any model which is used to provide specific directions in terms of what decisions need to be taken have to be governed. So there are extensive rules around model risk management, and we'll touch upon that. Interestingly, for financial services firms, model risk management is not new, in the sense that ever since the financial crisis, which happened in 2007, most large banks were aware that any decisioning that is coming through quantitative measures have to be kind of adequately covered and have to be governed and monitored over a period of time. And they set out a detailed program on model risk management through a paper called SR 11.7 back in 2010-11. And ever since, most of the large banks in the US have kind of ramped up big teams which are like tailored to look at specifically the outcomes of models that are being used to drive decisions across enterprise, right? So model risk has been a key focus, and with the advent of AI ML models, coming in 2016-17, wherein most of the upscaling of these models happened and continues to continues to grow today. These model risk management frameworks have significantly improved, right, and are kind of adopted to many of the nuances that these AI/ML models bring to the table. So that's an evolution process. We'll touch upon some of the model risk elements there. Technology and data interactions becomes extremely critical because there's several solutions which either large enterprises are aware or not aware that are using AI/ML in the background and therefore requires governance. There is a lot of alternate data that financial services organizations are using today, and there is a requirement to review what kind of data informs these alternate data sources, right? And make sure that those are clear of bias and do not impact protected classes. We'll talk about a little bit more on the data interaction bit. Regulatory compliance, more and more regulators are kind of coming up with, I would say, consistent messaging around what is expected out of these AI/ML solutions. And therefore, it is extremely important that all large organizations are aware of how certain solutions are impacting the customers directly, and also if they are violating any particular law or any particular regulatory guideline, which might kind of result in fines and penalties for large banks and insurance. There is an element of qualitative responsible AI, basically putting together a holistic framework, and we'll talk about a little on this piece as well, on how we can evaluate a particular AI/ML solution beyond the performance characteristics, right? So it's not only about, hey, how does the accuracy metric look like, or how does certain KPIs look like corresponding to a particular decision model, but look at some more dimensions which will enable organizations to effectively trust a particular solution, right? And then kind of continue from there. And finally, people and culture, in terms of getting the right training mechanisms, getting the right culture across the enterprise to effectively use AI/ML solutions, have explainability both internally as well as explainable as well as externally on how certain solutions are performing, right? So how does a large organization go, in terms of, what are the building blocks or steps that they take in order to enable, such governance mechanisms? So they will pretty much start with an organizational leadership emphasizing, the importance of this, like what we are talking today. We probably had all of these discussions starting way back in 2016, 17, when people realized that most organizations realized that they really wanted to have this particular function embedded in their enterprise. But then at that time, there weren't many regulatory, guidelines in terms of how to go about it. So we worked with multiple large banks and insurers, understood the requirement. We also helped some of the regulations that have come up, mostly around ensuring what we are seeing in AI, what kind of after effects are we observing, and how does one mitigate that. One of the building blocks here is kind of putting together an enterprise strategy and defining AI for an organization, right? So it is important for every employee of a large organization to understand what does AI mean to an organization, right? And what is the definition? What is the enterprise strategy? So most large organizations today are putting together their policies around AI in terms of where they will use it, what kind of governance and controls they have to manage outcomes coming from these. And of course, they are reporting that they provide to regulators to ensure that they are pretty much in sync with what is expected from a regulatory standpoint, right? In order to do so, they start the practice layer, wherein they would typically go about identifying an operating model in terms of how does AI-based decisioning, percolate in a particular organization. How does the team structure look like? What are the roles and responsibilities that needs to be created in order to kind of have these operationalized over a period of time. There is a detailed playbook around AI risk assessment, that what else needs to be done apart from looking at specific metrics that most of these models are throwing up. But what else does one want to look at, especially to protect any kind of reputational risk or harm to the name of the firm and so on and so forth. And then finally to the proof of concept, wherein they're looking for clear evidence of how an AI solution is successful in an enterprise. How does one How does an enterprise measure that? What is the ROI coming out of these AI solutions? And making sure that all of this is strongly integrated with existing operating models, meaning that you don't really want to reinvent the wheel. You don't really want to change everything that is there in an organization which has gained and benefited from the existing structures, but fitting these things into the existing layers. And we'll talk a little bit about the line of defenses that we used to work with earlier in the financial services world, and then how all of this AI ML governance is kind of getting structured into some of those components. Right. Briefly talked about the definition of a model and MRM, or model risk management. Again, this is something which is coming out of OCC, wherein they're talking about a model which says that it has to have an input component, which is the information component which is coming in. It has to have a processing component, and it has to have a reporting component, meaning that it should report out a particular estimate into a useful business information. Now, any solution which does all three is typically called as a model, and every model in an organization, it needs to be inventoried and has to go through a standard defined model risk management principle that is mandated by the Fed and OCC in the US, meaning that any FS organization, any financial services organization which classifies a particular solution as a model has to go through model risk management principles and go through, and we'll talk about a few things specific to MRM just to give you a flavor of what things are kind of evaluated today in terms to ensure that that these AI and ML solutions are performing to the best of their abilities. We briefly talked about the qualitative RAI principles, and I think the objective is entirely to look at a solution from a lens of building trust into a particular solution, meaning that if there is a solution which is kind of driving a certain kind of outcome automatically, or through some inputs which are getting processed through algorithms, there is clear accountability of that solution, meaning that one has, organizations have to define the key, with which entity or with which organization or with which individual does the accountability of the model performance reside with, right? There has to be adequate transparency about these solutions in terms of having a clear understanding of what is going in, how is it getting processed, and what is kind of coming out. Clear ideas around addressing bias and fairness concerns, that these models are the right models to kind of drive the right kind of decisions, and also making sure that none of the protected classes are getting adversely impacted by these solutions. Human and machine interaction, extremely important. That is something that we also call as human in the loop, meaning that is there a way in which we can adequately ensure that any machine specific outcome has a good element of human interaction, and basically ensuring that the outcome is closer to what a human would approve, right? I mean, that's the core ethos behind this particular dimension. And then we talk about data and security, which is ensuring that we are using the right data, we are using the approved data. For example, if we are collecting data from third parties, there is also a requirement to understand how has that data been collected? Has it come from deep web, or has it come from approved sources? Those are questions that needs to be understood. And we are also talking about security, making sure that this data resides in a secure environment. It is used for the right purposes, and it is also kind of is controlled in an environment wherein only certain specific entities or personnel have access to it, right? So these are, I would say, some of the broad level principles that will help build trust for an AI/ML solution. And while evaluating a solution before deploying it enterprise-wide, these are some responsible AI principles that one could work with. Okay. Next, quickly, giving an illustrative view of how, at the design phase of an AI/ML, these responsible AI principles can be, transposed upon each of the different elements of building the model, operationalizing the model and also conceptualizing and strategizing for that model, right? Again, this is a representative view wherein you can see that some of the blocks associated with DSNML engineering and how some of the responsible AI pillars on the right are being transposed upon. I think it's a good map to get a sense of what certain things should be looked at, when we are kind of at various stages of including and incorporating AI/ML solutions in our business. And finally, we briefly talked about the model lifecycle and basically integrating these frameworks in the overall operating model. In the process of developing these models, and if I look at the model lifecycle in the top half, you can see that there are elements of definition, development, deployment, and decommissioning of these models. And at every stage, there is this requirement for this AI governance mechanism to kick in. At the start, when one is defining a particular solution, there could be a toll gate mechanism through which one can do an early assessment of an AI/ML solution before it kind of gets embedded enterprise-wide, and kind of basically have some kind of an approval in place. Next, in the development stage, or maybe just between development and deployment, there has to be this assessment by the AI governance, just to ensure that the model pretty much turned up the way it was designed to be, right? It used the right data, it used the right algorithm, and it kind of had the right kind of use cases for which it will be deployed upon. And all of this in integration with the existing 3 lines of defenses. Now, a quick word about what are these lines of defenses. I mean, in financial services, as I mentioned, way back in 2007, post the financial crisis, there was this focus on model risk management, wherein each and every solution which was kind of throwing out an outcome had to go through 3 lines of defenses before it got implemented, right? The first line of defense was essentially at the type of development. So any particular model, to give you an example, for example, if you take a credit card application for that matter, and an individual gets approved for a credit card application, how much credit limit is allocated. These 2 decisions, right, the approval and the credit limit allocation, is typically governed through a model, because if you look at the best practices today, you will typically open up a particular organization's website, provide in your details, and probably in seconds you will get an approval or a reject, or maybe you will get a delayed decision saying that your information is being looked at, right? So an immediate approval that comes in is through a particular model that is looking at all the attributes corresponding to an individual's application, right? And based on all of these attributes, they're kind of giving a real-time decision that, hey, your credit card application is approved, and this is the credit limit that you'll pretty much be working with, and your card will reach to you in probably 3, 4, 5 working days, whatever, right? So now, given that this is mostly an automated, say an algorithm-driven process, how does one ensure that the algorithm is doing the right things? So in order to kind of maintain that, model risk management governance looks at 3 lines of defenses, meaning that the first stage of development is with the folks who are developing these algorithms. So kind of doing the testing internally and making sure that this is the right algorithm to kind of make this particular decision. The second line of defense is an external body, which then evaluates whatever work the development team has done. For example, as data scientists, a group of people might have helped put together this algorithm in place, right? And they might have provided a detailed documentation around it. Now, there is the second entity, which is the second line of defense, which rolls into a centralized, enterprise risk management function, which looks into all of these artifacts and documents, does a thorough testing, and then approves whether a particular model is good to go or not, right? And the third line of defense is essentially a central audit function, which not only, looks at the first line of defense, that is where the model was built, but also looks at the second line of defense, whether these model validators threw up, provided good challenges, or kind of ensured that the first line of defense has done its work. So there are typically 3 layers past which a particular algorithm will go into production and will kind of produce the outcomes that it does, right? So this is the existing setup. Now, in this existing setup, if we have to add a layer of AI governance, then it is basically kind of bringing in these concepts of toll gates and approval processes, including that into the existing three lines of defenses that are existing in most of the financial services funds, right? And then we kind of briefly talked about building trust in these solutions. So, finding out the ways in which, or finding out the dimensions through which each of these solutions will be looked at, in addition to the robustness and the accuracy of the outcomes that these models are producing.
Sorry.
Yes.
Let's go back. So it's great to see explainability come up here, and I've been meaning to ask kind of throughout the course of the last hour. So how do you see this race between sort of the advancement in how models scale and how models penetrate into the data sets and leverage even more so features of data sets, with the race and even academic perspective on explainable AI and being able to articulate why, in some sense, some of these decisions were made? I mean, I see these two, well, one moving much more quickly than the other, and I'm wondering if you see the same thing and you see this as a challenge.
So I'll address from a financial services standpoint, and we'll kind of touch upon explainability briefly later as well. See, for FS, it is extremely important that, so if I put it, so the regulators in FS has always looked at decisioning through causality, meaning that if there is a particular by anything, by human or by machine, regulators in financial services has always looked at it from a causality standpoint. That if you have made a decision X, then explain or give me 3 top reasons why. That's always been their approach, and it was easier when we had econometric models in place, which were standard statistical models. You had more or less a linear relationship or maybe a curvilinear relationship. Explainability was easy with earlier models, right? Now with the new AI/ML set of models coming in, which has like a multiple set of networks, or you can think about very complex algorithms which are kind of getting results, there is still a very high focus on the requirements on explainability, depending on the tier of the model. I'll talk briefly about tiering of models, because that is very critical in FS, and we'll go about it. Tiering of models essentially means that not all models and not all their decisions are equal, meaning some decisions are more impactful than others, right? So some decisions are impacting laws, some decisions are impacting customers directly, some decisions are probably operational, efficiency.
Oh, no, sure. Yeah.
Right. So the idea is that you look at individual models differently, you tier them up, and then for the most critical models, which are typically the tier 1 and tier 2 models, there is extremely high focus on explainability, on internal as well as external. And explainability, we can go into the details of global explainability, local explainability, explaining, and to some extent internal and external explainability as well. That not only do you need to explain an outcome to an individual outside of the organization, but also inside of the organization. Internal stakeholders need to know what is happening, right? So you cannot be, and that's one of the very interesting things that we observe with data science practitioners, right? And I being one, is we tend to develop extremely cool algorithms, and we think that this is the best thing that that could happen to mankind. And then we run into issues wherein some stakeholders don't understand what's going on, right? And then we say that, hey, probably, there is a requirement for you to upskill and understand what it is. But then the regulators are saying that no matter what, whosoever is trying to understand this particular thing, it has to come across as something which is meaningful and trustworthy, right? So going back to our principles of trust, explainability is an absolute key pillar, internal as well as external. We'll touch upon that very briefly. I'm not going into the mechanics of driving explainability.
Oh, certainly not that. Yeah. Is your sense that the frontier for kind of explainability research is moving slowly, or kind of less?
I wouldn't say it's moving slowly. I think it's moving in a reasonably adequate pace, right? What is different or what is challenging is the scaling opportunity of what. So any particular algorithm which scales, right, then your explainability has to also scale along with it, right? So if you are driving decisioning for 1 million customers a day, for example, or 1 million customers an hour, for example, take an example of a transaction fraud model, right? So these are credit card transactions, millions in numbers happening in minutes across the country, right? any large bank card, for example, right? Now there is this particular model which is defining whether a particular transaction is fraudulent or not. If it is defining it right, then it is saving dollars for the organization. If it is defining wrongly, then it is causing a bad customer experience. And it is also adversely impacting the organization, right? So if that is the magnitude of decision making in terms of the frequency and the accuracy of those decisions, explainability has to kind of provide some view of what is kind of leading to some transactions going through, whereas some transactions are not, right? So to answer your question, yes, I would say the pace is reasonably well. I would say a lot of advancements on extreme complex algorithms, breaking the black box, as we say. A lot of platforms that are currently in place who are kind of driving these decision making, or basically enabling these algorithms it's probably the top mandate to kind of get the right explainability tools, especially in FS and some other organizations. And yeah, I think that's so I wouldn't say that we are still in a place wherein we can use complex algorithms to determine capital adequacy for example, right? I mean, there are regulatory submissions on, hey, do I have enough capital to safeguard my shareholders? Those kind of decisions are still being made on econometric models. We have not seen AI ML advanced models kind of coming in there. Why? Because of the explainability problem. So till we get there, I think we are not yet there, but we are getting there. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. No, there's a sense from the outside that like one is lagging the other.
Mm-hmm.
I think the answer to that is that one's not lagging the other by as much as one.
It is not. It is not. I mean, see, the better it gets, it's always going to be useful. Currently, is it that good? Not really. And probably one of the top areas of research. So what we have, I just wanted to kind of glance through this in terms of quick learnings from our AI risk assessment, and just do a quick time check on where we are. Okay, I think we are pretty much on time. So I think mostly as we were talking about, right, preparing for regulatory exams, that is where there is renewed focus from these regulators to come in and try and identify areas on what are the gaps in terms of these AI/ML models. The definition of AI and enterprise strategy becomes extremely critical for all organizations. And the one important part here that I want to touch upon is managing AI risks for vendor solutions as well. Now, a lot of time, these large organizations are not even aware that they're using many vendor solutions which themselves are using AI and ML techniques, right? And therefore, there is this need of governance for vendor solutions as well, whose onus pretty much lies with the financial services organizations. So that's a tricky angle that most people are navigating through. Let me take this up, I think, very quickly on developing and managing models responsibly. As I said, among the top areas that you would want to kind of go about is the enterprise strategy and the definition of AI piece. I talked about risk tiering and model identification, kind of go through that briefly, and then a little bit on the requirements and guidelines and fairness and explainability. I think we touched upon some of those important parts already in answering to one of the questions. I'll not drain the slide here, which is more around the enterprise AI strategy and policy. I think the crux of the matter here is that it could be different for different sizes of the organization, meaning each organization has to define or identify what is their key objective. For example, a credit card issuer and the challenges that a credit card issuer might have could be significantly different from a mid-sized bank, which is entirely focused on commercial lending, right? So based on the requirement, based on the specifics around what is the business model for FS organizations, I think these enterprise-wide risk policies could be tailored. We briefly touched upon risk tiering, which was essentially identifying some models and their implications are greater than the others. Earlier, it used to be entirely based on materiality and criticality, meaning these were just they were pure numbers associated with tiering of models. But now we are increasingly looking at the impact of the models, the implementation setup of those models, what kind of data those models are using to first tier out the models effectively, and then kind of have tailored principles and frameworks associated with these models, right? In terms of the development guidelines, you'll see the ones marked in blue is probably something more than what we would do for traditional econometric models. These are basic guidelines which are coming up from regulators as well as data science practitioners who would want to kind of make sure that some of these additional parts, like clear identification of model purpose and scope, clearly having a view on what is the data that is being used for these models, lineage of those data elements, any automated feature engineering that is done, what kind of transparency we can provide on that, right? Then there is adequate availability of model theory and development process. So a lot of different things within these dimensions, they have to be adequately documented. There has to be adequate evidence for what we talked about, the 3 line of defenses, the first line, second line, and third line, to kind of approve any AI ML solution of that kind, right? And then we finally touch upon bias and fairness, which is pretty much a hot topic these days, clearly making sure that the model is applied on similar training data that it has been built on, right? So that's fundamental to kind of managing bias. We typically look at the bias from a data bias, from an algorithm bias, and an operational bias standpoint. Data bias is essentially, the elements which are intrinsic to the data that is being used to develop these algorithms. Some of the algorithms are better suited for specific purposes. When they are used for purposes outside of those, they tend to kind of throw up some bias, and then eventually on the operational side of it, in terms of monitoring and looking at model performance to check and mitigate bias of any kind. Similarly, I think fairness has to do with more on the outcome of it, making sure that that these models are not unintentionally discriminating some protected classes. So that is something that needs to be standardized across enterprise. We talk about the qualitative and the empirical part of it. Qualitative more for lower tier models, empirical more for higher tier models, which are directly impacting legal or impacting customers directly. And finally, we kind of briefly talked about explainability, wherein to answer your question earlier, probably there's some of the questions that we have kept here, that what does a good explainable model mean? That is the target state. So I understand why that particular model or solution has been implemented. We understand why not something else, right? That's also important. Then, having clear idea of success and failure criteria, and also building the element of trust that is associated with any particular AI or ML solution. So so I think we have 10 more minutes. So I'll probably go through the example and then take questions in the last 5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll quickly go through an example of a large program that we ran with a top 3 bank in the US. And the idea was exactly that. Back in 2016, the chief data scientist of the bank, approached us, and I was having a conversation. And his primary concern was not the best algorithm that he could use, but how to maintain the reputation of the large bank that they've built over 100 of years, right? So I think that was the first question that he wanted to address. And therein started a 2.5 years journey, wherein we started off with putting together the AI and enterprise strategy for the large bank across their global entities, making sure that all key stakeholders were aware of what AI meant for the organization, how to define AI, what are models, how to inventory those models, right? And then manage those models over a period of time, and then set up the operating model through which one would potentially go about governing all of these AI/ML solutions over a period of time, look at or set up key frameworks that are associated with AI governance, making sure that all of the models which are in the inventory are adequately reviewed, are monitored over a period of time, and made sure that none of the outcomes that are being produced fail the overall holistic test that the models need to go through, and set up the entire operating model accordingly. We also looked at some specifics around model operationalization, meaning that There were some legacy platforms on which some of the models were being deployed. We had to do some kind of rationalization of those platforms as well, making sure that those platforms are future ready for deploying these models at real time and basically getting to the decisions responsibly. We looked at the data quality offering as well, meaning that we had to kind of ensure that any and every data that pretty much is being used across the enterprise is vetted, is legal for the right purposes, and has complete lineage with respect to we know the sources of that data and make sure that all transformations that the data has gone through is adequate for the purposes for which it is being used. And then eventually look at the explainability testing and strategy in terms of what levels of explainability is required for what kind of decisions and what is approvable by the regulators, and making sure that all of this is integrated into a centralized governance framework. So that is at a very high level, a view of risk management associated with AI and ML in FS. Happy to take any questions that we have at this point in time.
Yes.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Robert. Thank you. I'm an alumni from mechanical engineering department. There's one quick question. Can you name a list of the technical components of AI risk management? Thank you.
So when you say a technical component, meaning?
Technology underneath the AI model, AI system framework.
Yeah, so you could think about multiple technologies, right? If I do a classification problem, for example, right? A classification problem would typically give out an outcome which is required to kind of take a decision, right? So if you are using, so essentially what we are doing underlying it, it's like any standard model, right? The only thing is that you're using a model outcome to drive decisions that you're kind of doing it in real world. I gave an example of fraud detection through transactions, right? So think about millions of card transaction data coming in, and you're processing them real time using a particular algorithm, which is telling you whether a particular transaction is fraudulent or not. And if it is a fraudulent transaction, then you get a call on your phone that, hey, looks like you made a purchase and so on. So can you confirm that you are the person who are making that transaction, right? And you get that trigger because based on the information and all of the data that is underlying it, it appears that the transaction is not usual, and therefore it wants to confirm with you whether you are the person who is actually making that transaction at that point of sale, right? So that's one of the applications that we can see, right? There are several such applications, right? Other applications could be that, hey, if I am doing a particular, so even if you think about OCRs for that matter, right? You are basically reading a particular paper document and digitizing it, right? So there is an algorithm which does that, right? So is it doing it? So how do you kind of measure the accuracy of it? Is it something which is sustainable given the multiple dimensions we talked about in terms of transparency, in terms of bias and fairness? Can it read all languages, or is it just specific to a particular language? All of these use cases are part of, so any and every use case which uses a particular model to get to some kind of an outcome, which informs the decision, everything is under the ambit of the AI governance umbrella. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, but not really. Can you go down further? Again, I'm from the technical background. Is there any existing system / software programming?
Yeah. So any particular system software, you can say there is, so when you go through airport, right, there is a clear score that you get, right? So when you're pre-cleared, so there is a clear score that comes in, which tells you that, okay, I can identify this particular individual, and you go through, right? So this is a particular software which works, which is essentially underlying that software is an algorithm, right? Any credit card application that you make to any card provider, it will give you an outcome straight up, very immediately, right? Nowadays, insurance claims, right? For example, people are using photographs that you provide of your car, to kind of get a sense of what kind of claims can be, is this a legitimate claim at all or not? And then kind of gives you back, okay, how much of that claim can be adjusted, so on and so forth. So applications are aplenty everywhere, right? I mean, there's a lot of, so we call it, whether we call it decision systems, we call it cognitive systems, all of this is within the umbrella of AI governance, that, all of it is kind of taken care of adequately. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
And thank you for the talk. You mentioned about the different layers, right? Different layers. So buyers, algorithm, deployment, and stuff. And also about the local activity and global. So how do you determine which of them is of most importance for a given situation or for a given task? Because for some of them, the operations might be not much larger than or for some of them, the transaction from itself being an impactful event, that would be a point of concern. So how do you determine the future, which is important and what given?
Yeah, that's a great. So that's the fundamental of tiering of the models, right? So when you look at the inventory of models that a particular organization has to maintain, say there are 1,000 odd models in that inventory, right? Based on what use case that a particular model. So there are several levels to it. What is the use case of that model, right? For example, is it impacting a customer directly, right? Does it impact or any I would say any lack of performance? Does it impact the reputation of an organization? Does the outcome reflect on or violate any particular law that is present in the land, right? Does this particular model use something which is reasonably biased against a protected class base, or there is a potential for it, right? These are some of the dimensions with which the first exercise before you go into the AI governance piece is to tier each of those models. So corresponding to the 1,000 models that is there in your inventory, you will use these dimensions, use these use cases to provide a tier to these models.
So that is a validation or status check.
Status, like, okay, this is model A, this is tier 1, this is model B, this is tier 2. Another example is an operational efficiency gain type of a use case, wherein, hey, I have been doing this in 40 hours choosing four resources. Today I'm doing it. Simple operational efficiency gain does not impact the customer, does not impact any law. You can potentially call it a tier 3 one, right? Which is not impacting things significantly compared to. So that is the assessment that that is the first part of model risk management. Once you have inventoried, you're going to look at the tier of the model. And then based on the tier, you will design your governance mechanism accordingly. So it's basically not a one size fit all, but you first tier those models and then basically look at, what kind of, whether you can go with a vanilla governance or you can go with a more focused governance. Those are the things that you kind of design on top
of. It is new, but I can ask you one question.
Sure.
I always ask, and it's super important for our students. What is your recommendation for that one skill set or that one thing that our students should walk away from our program, either soft skill or technical skill, either one that you think our students should really make sure to walk away from our program?
No, that's a great question. And I think my answer will be a bit biased because I have essentially been part of the strategic consulting business all this while. And my buyers have always been business folks, right? And I think what we do well is, end of the day, try and solve a business problem. So I think for data scientists who are kind of coming up, that lens of looking at a problem, trying to solve a business problem, I think that is something we miss out sometimes, especially when we're trying to develop something very cool and unique and which is kind of high on accuracy and stuff like that. So understanding the lay of the land and what business problem is, one tries to solve using a data science enabler, that is something which I think is extremely valuable in industry today. That not only are you, I'm sure that we have some great data scientists who know their stuff, and people will be excellent at that. Just a slight added layer of understanding the business problem and kind of tailoring the solution to meet the business problem, that goes a long way, because that basically translates a cool technology to solving a real world problem. That's probably something that I can do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we want to thank Ibi for his talk today, in person or virtually, and just give him a hand and hopefully be back.
Thank you.